We did not honor you vets. And last was, I don't know what that was. Did I do something wrong, son? Did I offend you? Water off anytime he wants to. I don't know what's going on. Well, anyway, all you vets, would you stand up? Veterans of armed, God bless you. There we go. We love you. And please accept my apologies because of all the people you do not want to forget are those veterans. I mean, you laid your life down for our country and we can't say thanks enough. I want to talk to you about baptism for just a minute. Friends, I want you to know that there are some of you in here that have refused to be baptized. What is the deal with this? These fancy new... Everyone, this is my son, John. Test. You go turn it up? Thank you, son. Well, I'll tell you what the deal is. Ronnie set me up, and he's ticked about last weekend. So that's what's going on here. But anyhow, I want to talk to you about baptism for just a minute. This is a huge deal. Some of you have crossed the line of faith in your heart, but you have not done anything publicly. And as your pastor, I am saying to you that those of you whose heart is stirring them right now about this is something I need to do, I want to encourage you. Yea, I even want to kick you. Not really. Somebody just looked up and went, oh my God, I came to the wrong church. This pastor kicks people. It's not true. I want to influence you as much as I can possibly do that this is the next step for you. So if you have not followed the Lord in water baptism, please be there tomorrow night. All right? Oh, you scare me. All right. Nehemiah chapter 5, as we continue our series, Take a Risk. Rebuild your life. And tonight we want to talk about dealing with opposition from within. Now, friends, let me say something to you. Regardless of the opposition, whether from within or without, there is one purpose that's involved. One purpose. You know what it is? To get the building that God is building you, or the building that you are helping God with, stopped. He wants to stop that. That's exactly what's taking place here with Nehemiah. Nehemiah is now going to have to deal with an issue of attacks that are coming from within. In other words, the nobles and the officials, as we'll read about it in just a moment, were taking the people that were working on the wall, and they thought that there was a way that they could take advantage of and make money from those people that were working on the wall. Nehemiah has faced about every kind of challenge that he can possibly face. He has had to go to King Artaxerxes. And that was a big deal, if you'll remember that in chapter 1, about him going because he didn't know if he was going to live or die. But he didn't allow that to stop him. He had to go across a barren land with a bunch of bandits. Even though he had an army with him, it was still a barrier that he had to overcome. He came and looked at the walls, and the walls were overwhelmingly discouraging to him because there was a lot of work to do, but he did not allow that to stop him. And even Sanballat and Tobiah that we read about last week, or that Paul talked to us about last week, they could not stop him. But friends, listen to this. None of those things were as strong as this particular attack that came from within. This brought the whole thing to a screeching halt. Nehemiah is at a place in his leadership now that he knows that as a leader, he's got to deal with this problem. Now, let me just stop and just say something to you right here. Every one of us have to deal at some time or another in our lives, whether it's us that's causing it or somebody else that is causing it. We have to deal with the attack from within, because if we don't deal with it, what's going to happen to us is the wall is going to stop. This is the biggest thing that is going on in Nehemiah's life right now. It's the greatest challenge that's ever been presented to him. And he knows that he's got an issue here that has to be dealt with. And so he's going to take a whole lot of time and he's going to deal with this for one purpose only. And let me tell you, as a leader, I know exactly what's going on in Nehemiah's heart. He sees the project that God wants him to do, and he's not going to allow anything to stop that. But this attack from within, from his own family, if you want to call that, from his own workers, whatever it was, or however you would like to determine that, was something that he was going to deal with. Now, Jesus just has a way of just nailing things. I mean, he can just say something in one statement, and it seems like it is a conclusion that just clears up the whole thing. And he makes this statement about a house, and he just simply says this: a house divided against itself will not stand. Period. That when there is an attack that's going on within, eventually what's going to happen is this whole thing is going to fall apart. Now, you mark my words, friends, whether it's in a marriage, whether it's in a family, whether it's in a business, whether it's in a church, whether it's in a school, whether it's in an organization, whether it's in a sports team, that when the attack starts from within, you don't even have to worry about the opponent. Your biggest opponent is on the inside. And there is an issue that is going on here, and Nehemiah knows that he has to deal with this particular issue. He knows that there is something there that is going to take away the life of what God has actually started in this whole dynamic of building the wall. And so therefore he is saying to them, listen guys, we are not going to allow this to take place. And so he takes it up a step. Now, there's one name that I want to give to you tonight that I think that most of us that are sports fans, and even if you're not sports fans, you've probably heard of this in the last couple of weeks, that has demonstrated this point just so openly, and that name is Terrell Owens of the Philadelphia Eagles. And what has happened to Terrell Owens is this, and now friends, just mark this. If anybody allows themselves to have pride that takes over their mentality, that basically says this to them: you are more important than the team, that is the beginning of the end. And the problem with the Philadelphia Eagles, and if you don't know who the Philadelphia Eagles are, let me just say this. The opponents, which a couple of weeks ago were the Broncos, and we won, really, the problem is that they can't even concentrate on their opponent because they have so much dissension on the inside. And you and I have to just simply kind of take a look at this and recognize. Now, friends, I am not here to accuse or to say anything, but I just want to make a prophetic statement to every one of us here. All of us have participated in this at one time or another. And so there's not a person here under the sound of my voice tonight that doesn't deal with this whole thing about opposition from within. Now, let me boil it right down to a bottom line here, and it goes something like this. What happens to us when we get ourselves involved in an issue that really needs to be resolved, I want you to know that that energy that it takes to solve that issue stops the energy that should be going towards the wall. See, and it's the old divide and conquer. And I can guarantee you, friends, that in your marriage, in your home, in your church, in your work, in every place that you are, there is a strategy of the enemy to divide and conquer you so that you will stop working on the wall. That you will be forced to look away from the actual thing that God has called you to. And so Nehemiah, being a very wise leader, says, look, I'm going to deal with this. I'm going to take issue with this, and we're going to bring a final kibosh to this whole thing. And so he wants to direct again the energy that is being used to try and solve this problem back upon the wall. So I want you to turn to Nehemiah chapter 5. And listen to this. Now the men and their wives raised a great outcry against the Jewish brothers. And some were saying, we and our sons and daughters are numerous. In order for us to eat and stay alive, we must get grain. Others were saying, we are mortgaging our fields, our vineyards, and our homes to get grain during the famine. Still others were saying, we have had to borrow money to pay the king's tax on our fields and vineyards. Although we are of the same flesh and blood as our countrymen, and though our sons are as good as theirs, yet we have subject our sons and daughters to slavery. Some of our daughters have already been enslaved, but we are powerless because our fields and our vineyards belong to others. And when I heard this, now this is Nehemiah, when I heard their outcry and these charges, I was very angry. I pondered, notice the word pondered, them in my mind, and then accused the nobles and the officials. I told them, you are exacting usury from our countrymen. So I called together a large meeting to deal with them, and I said, as far as possible, we have brought back our Jewish brothers who were sold to the Gentiles. Now you are selling your brothers only for them to be sold back to us. They kept quiet because they could not find anything to say or nothing to say. So I continued, what you are doing is not right. Shouldn't you walk in the fear of God to avoid the reproach of the Gentile enemies? I and my brothers and my men are also lending the people money and grain. But let the exacting of usury stop. Give back to them immediately their fields, vineyards, olives, groves, houses, and also the usury charging them. The 100th part of the money, grain, new wine, and oil. Let me just stop and say this. They had an issue that was legitimate. It was absolutely legitimate, and it needed to be taken care of. And Nehemiah knows that. We will give it back, they said. I love that when people respond to a leader like that. And we will not demand anything more from them. We will do as you say. Then I summoned the priests and made the nobles and officials take an oath to do what they had promised. I also shook out the folds of my robe and said, in this way may God shake out of his house and possessions every man who does not keep this promise. So may such a man be shaken out and emptied. Very interesting words, aren't they? You have your little outlines, you want to follow along? Let's take a look at 5 ways to disarm an attack within. 5 ways to disarm an attack from within. Number 1 is this: determined to find a solution. Friends, if you don't get a hold of this one, the rest of the points won't matter. Determined to find a solution. Verse 5. Although we are of the same flesh and blood as our countrymen, and though our sons are as good as theirs, yet we have to subject our sons and our daughters to slavery. This was an issue that concerned the children of the workers and how they were being mistreated. Now, let me just tell you as a parent and watching some of you and being around the ministry for a long time, I don't know of anything that changes the direction of parents any more quickly or brings a skid to their life when they understand that their child is suffering. Nothing. I mean, it's just like everything in their life goes right there, and rightfully so. And Nehemiah is such a wise leader that he recognized. Now, friends, understand this. Nehemiah discerns what the problem is. He knows that this is a legitimate issue and that this issue needs to be taken care of. And if it's not going to be taken care of, then the wall is not going to go forward. Pete Drucker, who is a management guru. If you don't like the word guru, he's just a really smart guy and does a lot of work in management. And he says this: the responsibility of any leader, the first and foremost responsibility of any leader is to define reality. Define reality. And he has defined reality, and he is basically saying to these people, look, we have to find a solution. Now, the rest of this chapter, friends, is this: is the determination that is in Nehemiah's heart as a leader to settle this issue. Now, here comes the $64 question. And I really want to play on this one for just a minute. Here's the $64 question. Do we have the resolve in our heart to find the solution to the problem that we're dealing with when we're talking about an attack from within? Nehemiah had that kind of determination in his heart. Let me take it one step further. Here's something that I think that all of us as Christians, especially in the Western world, really have to begin to grapple with. And the question is this. This whole situation was not God's will. This whole situation that Nehemiah is dealing with and this attack from within is not something that God planned, nor did he want it to happen. Nehemiah takes the initiative and says, we are going to do something about that. And sometimes, friends, I think this is what happens to us in Christendom over here, is that we become fatalistic without even realizing it. Que sera, sera, whatever will be, the future's not ours to see. I wished I could sing it. Sacred. And the point of it is that here's dear Nehemiah, and he's just proving a point. This is not going to go on. I am determined to find a solution to it, and I just want to encourage some of us in here this morning that are battling an attack from within. There is a solution. We just have to be determined. And so did Nehemiah, and he got over it. Number 2 is this. Direct your anger towards the solution. Here's a big one. Direct your anger towards the solution. Verse 6. And when I heard their outcry and those charges, I was very angry. He was ticked. Here's a godly leader who has become angry with the situation and will teach us about godly anger. Now, let me just presuppose this, that most of us in here probably have not done a study on God's anger. As a matter of fact, this is one of the issues that most people that are unchurched really have a problem with, is because that's all they see, that God is angry. But when you go back into the Old Testament and even the New Testament, you will find times that God got angry. But I want you to notice what God does with his anger. So anger must be an okay thing. But we also know that there's a negative side to anger. And here's what God does always with his anger. He never loses his temper. Aren't we glad? I mean, can you imagine God throwing a temper tantrum? What that would look like. God never loses his anger, but he allows his anger to dwell up within him to bring, now notice this, a solution to the situation. There's a reason why God has given you anger. There's a reason why Nehemiah is looking at this thing and he's full of anger, because there's an unjust situation that's going on. And so we need to look at this thing and say, now, what is good about anger and what is bad about anger? There are 2 different words in the New Testament for anger. The first one is this, orge. O-R-G-E-I. And I looked it up and it says, you pronounce this orge. Now, let me tell you what orge is. Because all of us deal with anger, friends. Every one of us deal. And here's the point about orge. Orge is the kind of anger that is a seething kind of anger that lingers over a long period of time. Let me stop and just say this. Some people are so angry and they don't even know what they're angry at. But when the right opportunity comes up, there is an incredible amount of release of this anger. And sometimes they are even surprised by the amount of anger that comes out. And it's because it's this seething type of anger. And it's the very anger that Jesus said in the Sermon on the Mount. He said, it was said of old, thou shalt not murder. But I say to you, whoever is angry with their brother is guilty of the same thing. What is he saying there? I'll tell you this. He's saying the attitude that leads someone to murder is this orge, this seething kind of anger. This anger that just waits for the right opportunity, and then when somebody says something wrong, before it even stops, or before you even have a chance to stop, whoop, it's out there and you're just whacking somebody to death. And there's not a person here, friends, that hasn't sent an email or said something to somebody that what they wish, man, I wished I wouldn't have said that. And the reason why we did it at that particular time was simply because we were angry. Now the second kind is this, thermos, or thumos. I'm not good at Greek. Didn't study this stuff, but anyhow, this is what thumos means. Thumos is really where we get our word thermometer from. And this is the kind of anger that Nehemiah uses. And it goes something like this. You see an unjust situation, your temperature rises, but now your anger is used to solve the problem. not just to blow up. It's used to solve the problem. And that's why the Apostle Paul in Ephesians comes around and says, do not let the sun go down on your anger or upon your wrath, because then it turns into the seething type that will really destroy you. So if you're angry about an unjust situation, just exactly like Nehemiah was, Nehemiah used that energy to actually solve the problem. Now, what happens when you solve a problem? The anger subsides. It goes away. You see, you deal with it. You take care of it. Number 3 is this. Allow for time to contemplate the issue in your heart. Allow for time to contemplate the issue in your heart. Verse 7, I pondered them in my mind and then accused the nobles and the officials. I told them, you're exacting usury from your own countrymen. So I called together a large meeting to deal with them. Now, Nehemiah exhibits an incredible amount of wisdom because he shows restraint in his response. He takes time to think through the issue. Now, listen to what ponder means, friends. Ponder means to weigh in the mind, to appraise the situation. Now, notice this, to think about success. God wants to give you success in this attack from within. Now, I really like what it says in the New American Standard. It said, I consulted myself. Now, friends, I want you to know that you came here for revelation tonight, and this is the best it's going to get. And here's how it goes. This is what God says, it's okay to talk to yourself. Because that's what he did. He stopped and he talked to himself. As a matter of fact, while I was preparing this message, I walked into a room and a good friend of mine was in there, and I heard her talking as I came in the room. She says, you probably think that I'm nuts. Because I was in here talking to myself, and I said, no, actually, I think it's godly. Talking to yourself is a good deal. Now, here's the thing that I want you to know, is that I don't know how long Nehemiah consulted his own mind about this. But I do know this. It was over a period of time, and then it was like with clarity it came. Now, let me give you the 2 ways that it came to Nehemiah. And this is the way that we solve, friends, the attack from within, is when it really becomes clear. And Nehemiah got wisdom because he consulted. Obviously, he was asking God for wisdom. And it says in the New Testament, we need to ask God for wisdom. We need wisdom. And so he's praying, and then all of a sudden, this is what he gets. I'm going to meet with the nobles and the officials. And so he takes them. There's 2 meetings that go on here, and you can study it for yourself. He takes the nobles and the officials aside. And he says, listen, guys, what you are doing is not right. And the reason why I know that there was great authority and conviction in what he had to say is because they agreed with him. Where did that knowledge come from? Why was that? There's probably 2 things that are going on here. Number 1 is this, is that he has the backing of the scriptures to say that you are not to charge your brother usury. And then second of all, he's the leader. And somehow this word gets through to these nobles and these officials, and they go, hey, Nehemiah, you're right. He says, okay, what's going to happen here from this? Then we're going to the bigger meeting, and you're going to tell those guys that you're going to release them from the debt. You don't think that wouldn't have been a happy meeting? Wouldn't it be happy if somebody, banker, came in and says, you don't owe it anymore? And that's exactly what's going on here. And so they all come together, and they have this huge meeting, and Nehemiah tells them, hey, listen, these guys are setting you free from all your debt. And that word, friends, disarmed the attack that was coming from within. And it's because he pondered it in their minds. Now, I want to give you a little secret, something that I've done for years about this. Friday afternoon, when I get through studying, I close my book up and usually go for a drive or go somewhere and just think. And this is a prayer I've probably prayed for at least 10 to 15 years. And that is this. You know, the Bible tells us that the Word of God is like water. And, you know, Jesus told the people at the marriage in Canaan of Galilee, the first miracle he ever did, he said, fill the pots with water. And I always tried to imagine myself as somebody that has just filled my pot with water. And then I pray this prayer, now, God, you've got to turn it into wine. You got to turn it into wine. And see, friends, I think that there is something that as we meditate upon those attacks from within, that God begins to turn the water into wine. And that's where that process of something that becomes real clear to us is simply because God is now acting in that situation and we know what the second move is and what we should do. I have found this principle, and somebody said it years ago, and I just remembered it. It goes something like this. If there's a mist in the pulpit, there is a fog in the pew. And that just simply means this. If we don't know where we're going with clarity, friends, we're not going to lead anybody into clarity. And Nehemiah had understanding of what the problem was, had clarity of it, and was able to speak into it and solve the problem. Number 4 is this. Resolve the issue for God's sake. Resolve the issue for God's sake. Verse number 9. So I continued. What you are doing is not right. Shouldn't you walk in the fear of God to avoid, now notice this, the reproach of the Gentile enemies? This is the second time that Nehemiah has spoken to the people about seeing the bigger picture. Earlier, Nehemiah states that we need to rebuild the wall so that we will no longer be a disgrace. Now, there's always two sides to a controversy. That's why they call it a controversy. So there are two sides that are being dealt with here. And Nehemiah is saying, look, guys, you need to think about this and get it in the bigger picture. And friends, let me just say this to you. All of us have to become bigger picture people. I mean, obviously there was a wrong side and a right side. But Nehemiah is saying, look, you got to think of this because there's one name that's going to be dragged through the mud if we don't settle this issue. And who is that? God. God's name is going to be dragged through the mud. That's why you got to take care of this issue. In other words, you got to step back and say, at some point I got to realize that it's not just about me, it's about the kingdom of God. Now, and this is exactly what Nehemiah is thinking. He's thinking, if we cannot settle this issue, then what's going to happen to all those Gentile nations that are around us? They're going to look at us and say, why would we ever want to follow their God if they can't settle their own issues? Now, let me just tell you something that in my life that I have learned. I think one of the greatest blessings I ever had was working for my dad for 12 or 13 years before I ever became a pastor. And the reason why is I learned this. I learned what it was to put in 50, 60 hours a week and understand that there's an incredible amount of resistance in the business world. And fights you have to go through. Anybody out there that recognizes that, And then you come to weekend services or church services, whatever it is, the last thing that you want to do, friends, is to engage yourself in another fight. You don't want to be there. See, and the point is this, is that we are demonstrating to a world out there that is saying we need a God. And the sad part about it is that, probably the greatest thing that ever happened in the church was the Reformation. And you know what probably the greatest problem in the church has ever been? The Reformation. You know why? Since the Reformation, we've had over 22,000 denominations that have started. I want you to think about that. And you know what Jesus said? I pray that they all might become one. If we become one, if we put down our issues, if we learn to love one another, by this shall all men know that you are my disciples. You got to disarm the attack from within for one purpose and one purpose only, and that's God's glory. You go to 1 Corinthians chapter 6. And here's Paul trying to teach the New Testament church about how to deal with matters that even believers are going to the courts with. And Paul says, wait a second, guys. Think about this. What will the unbelievers think? There's a bigger picture involved. There's God's name that is at stake. How we really live our life really does have an impact on other people. As a matter of fact, Paul gets so bold about this as he says this. Why not be wronged? Why not be cheated? For Christ's sake. For God's sake. Literally. Don't allow this to become something that becomes a fragmentation, an attack from within, so that the rest of the world doesn't know that there's a God amongst us. He says, deal with your issues, but by all means, friends, recognize that there is a bigger picture. It's not just about us. It's about how we get along with one another. Remember, it's God's sake that we're after. Number 5 is this. God will hold us accountable for our agreements. Now, this is a big one. Let me read this to you, verse 13. I also shook out the folds of my robe and said, in this way, may God shake out his house and possessions, every man who does not keep his promise. Now, the reason why Nehemiah is conducting this practice is to remind the people about making a promise before God is a big deal. As a matter of fact, friends, the reason why Jerusalem is absolutely disintegrated at this particular point is because the people of God broke promise with God. And God said, this is exactly what will happen to you if you don't keep promise with me. I'll bring somebody else in. They'll drive you out. You'll become their servants and their slaves. I don't want to do that, but don't break promise with me. I mean, God is dead serious about this stuff. When I do a wedding ceremony, every time I do a wedding ceremony, I stand before these people. They don't have a clue what's coming, but I stand before them and I repeat what Ecclesiastes Proverbs says about a vow. It's better not to make a vow than to make one and not keep it. That we have made vows before God, and God is a promise-keeping God. And He wants us to keep those vows before Him. This happened years ago. I was in a real tight spot, not only in the church, but in the business when I was in business with Dad. And came to a place that I just couldn't get out of it. And I was coming over the 5th Street Viaduct. And maybe it's because you're closer to heaven. I don't know. And I was just praying about this thing. And I mean to tell you, when I got down to the bottom there, and that's where the old public service building was. They are now removing, they have removed it and doing a lot of asbestos, I guess, was in the building. Right there at 5th Street and South Avenue, the Lord brought back something in my mind of a pledge that Cheryl and I had made to a ministry. And we hadn't fulfilled it. And I knew as clear as anything that God had ever spoken to me, you made a promise. You need to fulfill that promise. And friends, we fulfilled that promise. Because I recognized that when you just, and I had said to this friend of mine that was in ministry, I had verbally made a commitment. Let me just tell you something about this. When your heart and your mouth agree on something, God really takes it serious. It's not just, God doesn't come down and notarize the papers when I say, will you, won't you, do you, don't you? But the point of it is that God is in agreement when we come to those kind of vows, and that God is saying, I really mean business about this. The other day I was sitting with a pastor at a pastor's conference. And this pastor lives in Park City, Utah. And he said the real estate market there is just incredibly hot. This guy is moving away from Park City to plant another church. And he said, I sat on my house for 3 months. And he says, sometimes when a house goes on the market, it's only on the market for hours. And so he's going, God, what's the deal here? And he said, as clear as I've heard anything, I remembered a message that was spoken about tithing. And this guy that was speaking the message that this pastor was listening to said, when I have a block in my life, I always go back to my checkbook and just make sure that my tithe is up. He said, I went back and recognized that I hadn't tithed. 1 month, he said, I just simply forgot it. He said, at that moment, I took my checkbook out, wrote the tithe check out, ripped it out, and put it on. He didn't even take it to church. Put it on the kitchen table. In 2 hours, 2 hours, friends, he had a contract. Now, I'm from Colorado, and I'm rather simple, but I do not believe that was coincidence. See? Now, here's what I'm really trying to get across for you. I was reading the other day in Judges, chapter 11. And there's a guy by the name of Jehu. And God raised him up to go fight the Ammonites. Jehu had never, ever been to war before. And now he is the commander-in-chief. And he's got all this responsibility of these people behind him. And so on his way to war, he stops and says to God, and you would, and I would probably do the same thing. You know, God, if you will give me victory, I will make a vow to you that when I come back from that victory, that whatever comes out of the door of my house, I will give to you. He went to war, and there was victory, and he came home. And as he came home and approached his house, guess what came out of his house? His daughter. And the plot thickens. His only daughter. And even plot thickens even more from there. And she was a virgin. And he tore his clothes and he said, oh, man, I am so sorry, but I have made a vow to God. And she said, Dad, I understand. You know, something, I mean, God, you know, you can take that any way that you want to, but something that is said to us, friends, is this, is that when we utter from, and there's probably a couple of lessons that we can learn from here. When we utter from our hearts and speak to God about something that we said He's going to do, it really does reverse the attack, because that's exactly what Nehemiah is doing to these people. The reason why we're amongst ruins, friends, is because we broke the promises. I want you to stand, and I want the worship team to come back. Here's two things that I felt like were from the Lord. Number one is this. There are some of us here that are afraid to make an agreement. And it needs to be sealed with a promise. See, and it's like, because of the society we live in, boy, we don't want to get ourselves in that kind of a corner. But I'm telling you this, friends. Some of us, the way we're going to disarm the enemy is we're going to make whatever the plan is that God has said to us, and with whomever it is, and we're going to make a deal. We're going to settle this thing, you see. And then there's another category of people that I think the Lord wants to speak to, and that is this. Some of us have forgotten the promises that we made to God. And I believe that God is saying, you know, one of the ways that I love and delighting and blessing my people is when they live up to their promises. And all I'm going to ask you to do is this, is to say to the Lord, God, if there's something in my life that I have forgotten, you know, if the reason why this attack is going on is because I haven't fulfilled the promise to you, then Lord, I want to fulfill that promise, because I understand that you're a promise-keeping God, and He wants a promise-keeping people. Let's worship the Lord, and I'll come back and pray with you.